Well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and thank you very much for having me here. I have another question real quick. Does everybody have one of these cards that I handed out? Okay, excellent, great. Some people don't. So in this case, I'm slowly running out of them, but I'm going to hand out a few more. If not, you will have to ask your neighbor to help you out. Okay. If you wouldn't mind, pass these along. Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, and it's about something that seems very simple to us. And I'm going to argue it's something that's very important to us, and that's vision. So the fact that we can see, that we appreciate the world through our eyes, I hope I can convince you is one of the most important tasks that we use in our daily lives. Not only is it very important when we see, I will go on, and I hope I will be able to convince you that it is also one of the most complex tasks that our brains do any of our waking moments. And I will go on and show you and hope to convince you that it's this complexity that is marvelous that we're trying to get as neuroscientists these days, and that we're trying to help colleagues that are working with computers to get it. And I want to give you an overview of how far things are along there and what we can learn from the brain in order to improve computer vision. Before I do all that, I want to share a little bit of my private life with you. So I am not just a vision scientist. When I go home, usually late at night, I had to find a hobby that I can do at night. And I started to do amateur astronomy. So I bought one of these telescopes that you can, one of these days, this is a photograph of the moon that I took with that. This is a higher magnified version that I'm quite proud of. And here's the pearl out of the collection of my photographs. That colored blob is Mars. It's the planet Mars that I was able to capture with my own telescope. And you can see that that's not quite as impressive as you would think, but I'm showing you this because you can buy these telescopes for a couple $100. And I'm not telling you because I have any stakes in telescope vendors. But these are quite fine, magnificent instruments because in the old days, this is what you got. So here's a drawing from Percival Lowell, who was a rich American entrepreneur, and he put a lot of his money into amateur astronomy. You can see him gaze through one of his telescopes that he built up in the California desert. It's up there to this day, the Lowell telescope. You can still gaze through it and look at Mars yourself. And you can see to the lower right one of the drawings of how he saw and appreciated Mars looking through this telescope. And there's one feature that I'd like to point out. And you can see these are all these lines. And these lines gave inspiration to a whole slew of research and literature. So I'm just going to show you one here. That is the book that he wrote, and he called it Mars and Its Canals. So he was so taken by the fact that there were these lines that he could see on the surface of that planet that he wrote a book. And in this book, he argued that that is an indication, or proof rather, that there's intelligent life on Mars. You can see this drawing right here. That is what he thought would be going on. Basically, these lines that he could observe from Earth, they must be canals that the Martians dug as an irrigation system for their farming culture. And of course, that was inspiration then to a famous book by H.G. Wells, The War of the Worlds. And most of you probably know when that was aired on the radio waves, people went into panic and shock because they thought it's real, that we basically are under attack from Martians. So what I'm showing you is that this discovery of Percival Lowell, what he thought is a discovery, these Martian canals, that impacted our culture for a very long time. And of course, nowadays we know we get very excellent photographs of the actual surface of Mars, that it looks rather boring and maybe somewhat disappointingly so. So this is a photograph of one of the most recent Mars probes, and there's anything but irrigation systems and farming culture. And if they're Martians, they're very intelligent because they're trying to hide from us. We can't see them in these photographs. So what happened? Well, this is where I would like you to use that little card that I just gave you. And please hold it very close to one of your eyes. It can either be the left or the right eye. And cover your other eye with your hand so that you only see through that one eye. And now look at the white screen right in front of you and jiggle that card back and forth very quickly. Just go back and forth very quickly, very quickly, very quickly. Hold it as close to your eye as you can. And I hope that you will see something. For those of you who can't see something, you can cover your other eye and hold it very closely. But you should see some faint lines. So it works. You can see faint lines? OK, so you can see some faint lines if you're very close. It should look something like that. And this is the original drawing of Percival Lowell, what he saw when he looked through his telescope. And right here I'm showing you the back of your eye on the lower right part. And that's a blood vessel pattern that is spanning our retina, the back of our eye. And indeed, it runs in front of the photoreceptors that catch the light and convert it to neuronal activity. It's called the Purkinje tree. And it's well known that if you have a very small aperture, just as you did with a very point light source, and you move it in front of your eye, you end up seeing something like that. It's basically the shadow of the blood vessels that you have in the back of your own eye. And obviously, with these very powerful telescopes, such as the one by Percival Lowell, that is exactly what probably happened to him. It's a very small focal point that comes out of the other end. And as he might have moved his head a little bit, he probably saw the blood vessels in his own eye. And it launched, up to this day, this craze about exploring Mars and finding intelligent life. So I hope that with that introduction, I could convince you that it's important to learn about vision and to know the limitations that we have. But it also shows that there's a major problem. So if we think about how vision starts, what I just showed you is that the eye actually isn't such a great tool, or not as good as we would like it to be. So this is, if you would look out into the world and you would see a woman standing right in front of you, this is the projection that actually ends up in the back of your eye. You can see, obviously, it's upside down because of optics, because of the lens that you have in front of the eye. But you can also see kind of faintly here what I just mentioned, that you have these blood vessels run in front of your eye that actually obstruct a lot of the light before it ends up at the back of your retina. There's also distortions, obviously, because the eye is round, so things that are further out away from your center of view, they will get distorted. And many other problems that the brain has to solve in order to interpret this incoming information. So given all that, and that's going to be the upshot of my lecture, I think that the fact that we can walk through a door, as you just did, is one of the most marvelous things that, and one of the most incredible things that we can do. It is not easy, because you have to use this very limited information, and your brain has to make sense of it in order to solve this task. And it's not an easy task. Sometimes we get reminders for that, because walking through doors is not always straightforward. Because sometimes we miss things. Sometimes there are things to see that we don't see, and it takes knowledge about the world in order to be able to deal with it. And there are other times where we do think we see things, and there aren't any things. And then it would be hard to walk through doors as well. So why is it that we sometimes see things that aren't there and we don't see things that aren't there? Well, this is where I would like to talk about computer vision. And I would like to take us back to November in 2001 after 9/11. Obviously, there was a heightened demand of security in the country. And one of the possible solutions that was suggested is shown right here. People said that companies were quick to spring up to the forefront. How about we use the video cameras that we already have in all our airports, and we hook them up to intelligent computer programs, software that can recognize these faces and link it up with a database that contains all the terrorists, the known terrorists. So if somebody would check in on a terminal in an airport, and then walk through the plane, it would give us enough time to recognize the face of the bad guy and then pull him out and make sure that they don't go on that plane. And indeed, as you can see from these headlines, they all date back to September basically to 2001. These machines were installed in particular at Heathrow Airport. Airport in the UK, which is the main airport for the city of London. Well, is this still going on? Is this what's happening? Well, I can show you what happened a few years later. These are headlines that I took off the internet that from Heathrow Airport and other airports, all of these installations were shut down again. Because what happened is that when they get tested, and you took people that you put into the database and you tried whether the computer programs would be able to tease them out, they failed to do so. And likewise, people like you and me, hopefully we're not terrorists, we would walk through the airport and we get pulled out because the system would give a false alarm. So it just didn't work, and all these systems got dismantled. And I'm showing you this because we right now face a similar discussion again in our society. So we know that the NSA, the National Security Agency, is taking faces from web images and from our photographs. We know that the FBI is planning to do the very same thing and build up a face recognition database that's going to start next year. And we've all read these headlines that there'll be no escape from the FBI's new facial recognition system. So have things changed? In the last 10 years, have things gotten better? Can we now recognize these faces and use them for law enforcement? Well, at least we know that when it came to the Boston Marathon bombing, that didn't work. So here's a headline from the Boston Marathon bombing. There were lots of video cameras around, and the FBI tried to hook it up to these databases, and it was not sufficient to find out which people might have been around and might have been the subject. So even though the NSA and the FBI are collecting all these images, from a vision scientist perspective, it's still unclear whether they actually can use them, at least for these purposes. On the other hand, we all know that you can actually do quite amazing things with facial recognition software. So this is a program called Picasa that you can download for free on the internet. It's provided by Google. And what it does, it goes through your hard drive and it pulls out all images that you have on your hard drive, and it detects if there's a face in it or not. And if there's a face in it, then it tries to find out if you have more of these faces on your hard drive. And it pulls them together. So after the end of that process, you might find that there's a folder that contains all the images of some of your closer relatives or some of your friends. And it does a remarkable job in doing that. So good, actually, that some people nowadays are quite scared that if they just walk on the street, that facial recognition software might pick them out. And this is one thing that was recently suggested by one of the artists in New York, that maybe we should make something like this on Vogue, because if you wear a hairstyle like that, this software usually fails. And I can show you that that's true. Right here you can see a photo taken with an iPhone, and you can see that these two orange boxes are indicators that the iPhone detected two faces right in front of it, and the artist herself with that hairstyle does not get recognized by that phone. So if you're interested in that, I'm just going to provide this really quick. There's a whole slew of people on the internet that help out in getting these hairstyles. So what is the problem here? So Google is really interested in going a step further. And anytime people upload YouTube videos from their cell phones, for example, Google is aware that it contains a lot of information that is marketable, is eventually worth money. So if you could take any of these videos that get shot, for example, on campus by a student while you were working here, and the computer could make sense of it, shown like here, that you could see there's a man in the foreground, and then a pole and cars in the background. Well, Google could tie all this information together, and with the fact that there's a certain GPS signature here, it would know it's on Vanderbilt campus, it would know the date and time, maybe recognize your face, link it up to your Facebook account, and know that you were at that exact point in time at that location on Vanderbilt campus. And that's the ultimate goal that they're trying to get at. So how good are they? And again, we have to go with the headlines here, but they published about 1 or 2 years ago a study where they said, let's do it very simply. Let's just take a bunch of YouTube videos and find out if there's a cat in it. There's lots of YouTube videos with cats, but let's just make sure it's a video that contains a cat or not a cat. And how much computing power would that take? So here we have a situation now where you can measure your brain power, because that would be a very easy task for you to find out is there a cat or not a cat, with how many computers does it take nowadays to do this task. And the way that Google does it is that anytime you download their program, such as Picasa, there's this very long list of very small text that we usually just browse through and click OK. Some of these programs allow Google to use your machine while it sits there idle for computing power. So they can use thousands of computers at the same time to do these tasks. And indeed, that's what they did. And in order to find out if there's a cat or not, it turns out they needed 16,000 of these machines. Again, something that you can do just by opening your eye, finding out if there's a cat or not in front of you. Nowadays seems to take 16,000 computers. And obviously, I don't know where Google is headed with that, but I found out that they also publish now facial recognition software for cats. So sometimes when I feel a little bit down and one of my research grants gets rejected again, the way that I up myself a little bit is that I convince myself that there are things that even the smartest computers can't do yet. And this is one that a lot of you are probably familiar with, what we call a CAPTCHA. A CAPTCHA is something that's at the end of a website, and it's a little bit difficult to read, but you have to decipher it, and you just type it out. And this is how you prove to the computer that you're a human and not another machine that's just trying to hack in. And CAPTCHA actually stands for a completely automated public Turing test to tell computers and humans apart. So computers can't do these CAPTCHAs. They can't read them. They don't understand what these CAPTCHAs are. And that seems bizarre to us because CAPTCHAs are so easy for us to understand and to read. So I tried to, I'm going to do a little experiment with you again, try to put ourselves in the shoes of a computer. If you see a visual input, a raw visual input, and it might be hard to make sense of it. There's 4 pictures right here. One in the left upper corner, one in the right upper corner, and then 2 in the lower left and lower right corners. Who can make out something in the upper left corner? Some of you? Okay. Who is struggling to see something meaningful there? Okay. It's interesting. What about the upper right corner? Who can see something meaningful there? Okay, some of you. What about the lower left corner? Most of you. Oh, that's pretty good. And what about the lower right corner? Very good, excellent. So I'm going to give away now all the solutions. The upper left corner was a young woman with a hat. The right corner, a cowboy on a horse. There's a hand with a shadow in the lower left corner. And on the lower right corner was a map of the Mediterranean Sea. So you can see Italy here and the northern shore of Africa. So if I go back now to what I just showed you, probably you can see all these things. Does that work for everybody? So this is one of the remarkable feats of the visual system, that once you have a solution to a complicated visual input, it sticks with you. And indeed, studies show almost forever. So if we would poll you again in a couple of years and I would show you these images, you'll most likely see the ones that make sense to you now. But there was this one state just a couple of minutes ago where it didn't make sense to you, where you had this appreciation of what it might be for a computer to go through that. Now that's marvelous about what we can do, but I want to take it a step further and convince you that vision is not just complex, but really amazing in how we can deal with these problems. So I'm going to show you a couple of faces, and I'm just going to go from left to right, and I would like you to quickly yell out which faces you can recognize. So let's take the face to the very left. Excellent. One next to it? From Seinfeld, yes. Prince Charles, George Bush, Robin Williams, Woody Allen. Let's do it one more time. It's another row of faces from left to right. Prince Charles, Woody Allen, Bill Clinton, Saddam Hussein, Nixon, Princess Di. All right, so the reason that I'm showing you this is that from a vision scientist perspective, this is almost astounding and perplexing, because not only have you never met these people in your life, or I assume that most of you haven't, you were able to recognize them, but what I'm showing you here is also something that you've never seen. I doubt that you ever looked at the face of Ronald Reagan stretched out like that. So not only, so you can't just take what you had in memory about Ronald Reagan. There's something extra that you used in order to recognize that face. And the lower row, even more astoundingly, does not even contain eyes or a mouth. These are really just blobs of color if you look at them. And you nonetheless were able to not only see that those are faces, but recognize these individuals. So our brains are excellently designed to do this task. Indeed, they're so good at recognizing faces that sometimes they go overboard and you see faces where you shouldn't see faces. So this is an example of just a milk jug, a washing machine, a yogurt jar, and here's my favorite, just 2 drops on a fence. So this is a phenomenon that vision scientists call pareidolia. Pareidolia is our ability to see faces, or a tendency to faces where there aren't even any faces. And not only that, we also see emotion, where there really just are objects that just happen to resemble faces. And living in Nashville, I'm always happy to tell the story about who knows about this cafe that's close to Belmont University? So then you might have heard about this, which has been termed somewhat respectlessly on the internet, the nun bun, because it seems to resemble Mother Teresa. And if you walk into the coffee shop, you can see it. There's a plastic of it that's still on the left-hand side, together with a letter that Mother Teresa wrote to Bongo Java. However, the original you will not be able to see, because a couple of years ago there was a break-in and somebody stole it. And it has not been found since. Every couple of years there are photographs popping up anonymously from various parts of the world, sometimes on the beach, of that nun bun. So somebody has it and is teasing people. And as far as I know, there's a $5,000 reward. So if you know where it's located right now, you can make a lot of money. So this is pareidolia, our ability to see faces where there shouldn't be any, and even see personalities. Now, there's another quick experiment that I would like to do with you to just hone, again, the fact how well we see and how amazing that task is. And I'm just going to show you an image for less than a second, really just a blink of an eye, and then I'm going to ask you what you saw. Let's see how well we can do this. So are you ready? 3, 2, 1. What was it? A red house. What else did you see? Excellent. What weather was it? Blue skies. So was it winter or summer? Summer. That's all true. So it's a red house with a barn, blue skies, and it was summer because there's greenery around it. Again, I've just shown this for you for 100 milliseconds or less. And you were able to get all of this information out of this very brief moment of that light hitting your eye. So let's take it a step further. Okay, again, I'm going to show something very briefly. 3, 2, 1. What was it? It was like a painting. A painting. Yes, very good. What was on the painting? Did you see what was painted?
There was greenery.
Some greenery and a building. A blue sky. A brown building. All of that is true. So again, now in this case, not only did you recognize this was a painting, but you were able to see what was depicted on the painting. You were, again, making out there were blue skies and greenery. Even though, if you look at this painting, since, as you said, it's an impressionistic painting, it actually isn't really shown very well. There's, again, just a couple of colors and indiscrete scribblings. So your brain is not only able to extract photographs or things that you encounter in everyday lives, but even these abstractions very quickly. I want to do one more of these. So 3, 2, 1. Oops, sorry about that. Went a little bit too quickly. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so what was it again? The red house. Was it the same house that I showed you in the very beginning? Was a different angle, but could it have been the same house? Yes. Okay, so That is even more remarkable to vision scientists, because this obviously looks very different than that which I first showed you. But you were able to make out that even though you see it from a different angle, it might be the same house. So you were able to rotate it in your head to make out that this is the same house. And again, these are all tasks that computers just can't do. This is, you can do it in the blink of an eye, and computers really struggle with that. And it's summarized here in this cartoon that I very much like, where the man says to the woman, when a user takes a photo, that app that we're putting together right now should check whether they're in a national park. And the programmer says, well, that's very easy. We just have a GPS lookup. I can program that in a couple of hours. And then the person says, well, and we also should check whether that is a photograph of a bird. And the answer of the programmer is, I need a research team and 5 years and a lot of research money. So it's the other way around than we would see it. It's very easy for us to see if there's a bird in a photograph, but to make out if it's in a national park or not, that would be kind of hard. So the second part of my talk, I would like to talk a little bit about what we know, how the brain does that, how the brain does these incredible feats, and then maybe how we can use what we know to improve these computer programs and to make them better. And it's quite surprising how simple some of these solutions are. A lot of them were found in the 1930s, actually, by a group of psychologists that called themselves the gestalt psychologists. And what they found is that there's a group of laws that I depict here that they call the gestalt laws. And these laws seem to be applied by your brain to solve some of these visual puzzles. So one of these in the upper left, for example, is similarity. If you look at that display, really there just are a bunch of black and red disks, but you probably see a V shape in there. And the fact is that your visual system just uses the fact that there are red parts that are more similar than the black parts, and it groups them together, and that is why you see a V shape. Likewise, if we go a little bit below where it says symmetry, these are really just a few lines. But you probably see two groups of objects, one to the left and one to the right. Why don't you just see 4 lines together with a few lines that are orthogonal to it? Well, the brain seems to like symmetry, and it seems to group symmetric objects into unique objects. Common fate on the lower right is another excellent example, where instead of just seeing random dots, you probably see 2 lines that are moving backwards and forward. Does it work for everybody? Or you see them move up and down? Yep. So your brain seems to like common fate, meaning that these objects move together and groups them together, so you don't even just see a group of dots, but you connect them to a line. And there's more, such as closure, where even though we actually just have, again, just a few lines there, you probably see a square that's obstructed by an object that's right in front of it. So your brain seems to close these open contours. Good continuation is an interesting one in that you don't just see a line moving, the oblique line, moving from the lower left and then hitting a curved line and stopping, but you see it go on. So your visual system seems to appreciate and assume that when you have a situation like that, that an object continues after it meets another object. So these are inbuilt rules that seem to be part of your brain, part of your nervous system, that the visual system applies anytime you see an image and it helps it. And that is, for example, why you see these Olympic rings as 4 rings and not as shown below as separate parts, even though there would be an equally valid interpretation of that visual input. Likewise, if you see a branch that's hidden behind a tree stump, you would probably assume, and in fact you kind of see it, as a continuous object. And you would not assume what's shown here to the right, that these are 2 branches that are actually separated. So your visual system makes some of these assumptions just to quickly come to a solution. And the reason we know that is that if that is true, if there are these rules, then we should also be able to abuse them. And that is indeed what visual illusions do and artists do. So here's a really interesting art installation where the artist seems to be aware of some of these rules of the visual system and just put toilet paper around trees, but in a way that they lead to good continuation. So you see a white object here where indeed you have these separate tree stumps. Sometimes these things happen by accident. So this woman here just stands at the exact right point on that beach. Or right here, the rear mirror reflection just happens to match exactly what is shown in the foreground. And your visual system, because of good continuation, just sees it as one object. And sometimes it can really go wrong. So for some of you who might be soccer fans like me, you might have seen this one before. And even though we understand that these are wrong, and we understand what is happening here, we are unable to see the correct solution. So if I show you this again, you know that this is taken from below, and this is not the face of the actual person, but the dog of that person. Or in this photograph, you understand that this is not a small person riding on the back of a large woman, but just a person who happens to have dark pants that match the color of the sweater that the woman has wrapped around her waist. And that is something that I like about vision research. It is very humbling, because it shows that even though we have these incredible capabilities in our brains to immediately make sense of the visual world, there's also limitations to it. The very rules that allow us to make these very quick decisions about what we are actually seeing sometimes go astray. And even you might realize and know that they're going astray, you still see in this way because they're so hardwired. And obviously, there are other people that like to exploit this, not just artists and people that like visual illusions. So here you might have a very hard time seeing that this is actually quite a dangerous scene for you. There's a sniper in the middle of the scene. This is the gun. You can see the hat. This is the sniper person right there. And these are the legs. Can you see that person? So that is an example of what we call camouflage. As you know, it's ubiquitous in nature, and it's used by the military as well. And it is nothing but using these rules, such as good continuation, for example, to blend into the background. Since your visual system will see this as one continuous contour, it's very hard to make out that there is something that is actually separate from it. And there likely has been an evolutionary arms race where predators, natural predators, have tried to camouflage into the background, whereas prey, and we as primates, made for probably very good prey, had to find solutions to make out that there are predators in the scene. So I'm going to show you a photograph very quick now of an an African savanna, and there's an animal lurking in there. I'd like you to see if you can make out that animal really quick. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Who can see the animal? It is hard. Yeah, I might have misled you. It's not a predator in this case, it's a giraffe. Standing right here on the right-hand side, blending into the background. Now, once you've seen a giraffe, you really see it. You can make it out from the background. So your visual system is capable of parsing that as a discrete object. And what I would like to use it as an example to talk a little bit more about what we believe is actually happening in your brain as you realize there's a giraffe. And to make a long story short, we believe it's a multi-stage process where first your visual system tries to find out roughly what is going on and get a rough sketch of the scene that's right in front of you. And just as a sketch would just be the edges or the contours, so does the visual system probably first extract the edges or the contours of the scene. Now, once you have these edges, you have a problem because you have a lot of separate edges and lines. So as a next stage, these gestalt laws kick in, and you get grouping, and you group some of these edges together to, for example, find out which edges belong to the face of the giraffe and which ones belong to the background. And that process is called figure-ground segregation. So you're segregating the figure, the object in the foreground, from the background that's probably less interesting. And then ultimately, you can give that end result of the computation to higher brain centers that are involved in decision-making or memory, and they can try to find a match and can find out, oh, I've seen this before, that's a giraffe. But before that happens, you have to go through these multiple stages. And each of these stages is intertwined with each other. So even though it's a hierarchical process where you make all these computations in your brain, in the visual cortex rather, Each of these computations also gets input from later stages of processing, which is a process that we call feedback, and I'm going to come back to that later on in my talk. So this is exactly where we believe that computers and humans diverge. So if I show you this photograph right here, it's a black and white photograph of two vases standing right in front of each other. Most likely, most of you can recognize it immediately and have no problem seeing that. So you see it as something like this. Two vases, two objects are right in front of each other. But what I would like to point out is that that's not actually what's shown here. If you take a close look to the left-hand side, you can see that the side of the vase actually is continuous with the background. So the white just blends into the white background, both in the middle of the left-hand vase as well as the bottom of the left-hand vase. So the middle panel shown right here, that is, if you just take a quick sketch, that is really just the lines that are presented by the photograph. And this is exactly what a computer would see if a computer tries to do exactly what I just said the visual system is solving by extracting the edges first. In other words, we're back to the situation that I said at the very beginning, that in order to see, you can't just go with what hits the eye. There are things that you add. There are things that are not really physically present. In this case, the outer contour of the vase. Things that you see that don't really exist. And that is what you need to solve these puzzles, and that's exactly where the computers struggle. I'm going to show you, to make that a little bit more clear, one of my favorite illusions. What I would like you to do is just fixate the black dot on the center of the display. Don't look away, but just wait for what happens. So after a couple of seconds of just looking there, you might encounter two things. The first is that you start seeing a green dot emerging that is moving clockwise in the circle. Does that work? Yeah. And then if you keep on looking, you might also see that the magenta blobs keep disappearing. And you don't see all of them at the same time anymore. Indeed, if you keep looking for a very long time, you might just see the green dot. Does that work? If you move your eyes, you can convince yourself that there is no green dot, and the magenta dots were never removed, only one at a time. Does that work? So it's one of these examples that I'd like to point out, that we're literally hallucinating in this situation, even without having too much of a coffee this morning. You're seeing that green dot that doesn't exist, and at the same time, what's right in front of your eyes, these magenta dots, you fail to see. So not seeing the magenta dots, that would be an example of having a stimulus but no perception of it. And seeing that green dot that doesn't exist instead would be an example of having a perceptual outcome without a stimulus. Yes?
Does our eyeball get tired because I shift my vision to another part of the screen?
Yes. Yes, excellent point. So that's probably what happens. Even though this illusion is a great illusion, I'm not aware of a colleague that's really studying it, which is a great pity. But the idea would be that that's indeed what's happening, that there's what we call fatigue going on. And so because your neurons probably in the eye fatigue and stop firing and representing the input, your brain is now left on its own vices, and it starts hallucinating, for lack of better words. Now, as a vision scientist, even though I just said the very illusion that I've shown you is not under study currently, there are other illusions that are very similar, where we either not see something that is actually out there, or we see something that isn't out there, and then we can go into the brain and we can find out what's going on there. And so here's another illusion that I'd like to show to exemplify that. So these are 4 great circles, filled out circles that are moving back and forth, and on top of them 4 white circles. But if you look at that, you might see that there are lines spanning between these white disks, these white circles. Do you see these lines? So these lines do not exist. These are illusory lines that, again, your brain is just making up. Trying to find a gestalt law here, trying to see a shape where there is none. And you might have seen less vivid examples of this before. So these are very famous demonstrations of what's going on here. They're often called illusory contours or illusory shapes or subjective shapes. And some examples I'm showing you right here. It's an example of seeing something that's not actually here. So you might see a very bright white triangle here on the right, for example, whereas all I'm actually showing you is 3 black Pac-Men that are facing each other. Indeed, some people including myself, would argue that that white triangle is a little bit more white even than the background. It's a little bit more bright, which doesn't make any sense because it is really just a background. But your visual system sees it this way. Now, from a scientific perspective, there's two things that are happening here that are interesting. The first is that we call boundary completion. And it means that you have to span these lines between those Pac-Men to make up a boundary, a shape. And the second one is what we call surface filling in. It's that you make out a surface where there's none. So if I go back to the stimulus that I just showed you, you see faint outlines for that triangle. And again, these are lines that don't really exist. That would be the outcome of boundary completion. But you also see that white, bright square, and the brightness of it, that would probably be the outcome of surface filling in, that you see a surface there which doesn't really exist. And these are some ideas that people have come up with about how the visual system might solve it. So if we look at that stimulus to the left, you can probably see a square, even though it's really just squiggly lines. And the reason for that is that these lines all have the same orientation, whereas the lines that are surrounding have an opposite orientation. Again, just using one of these very simple gestalt rules, you group everything that has the same orientation, that is similar, together, and you make out a square. And what you see on the right-hand side is an idea of how that could, in the nervous system, be represented at first as a square due to boundary completion, and then later at the very last right-hand panel be filled in due to surface completion. So the idea is that if we interpret these illusions, we first extract the boundaries, and then we fill in the gaps in between. And that's very important. So if I show you this image here, on the left you might see immediately that this is a person. You might even recognize Marlon Brando as an actor. And on the right-hand side, it's the very same image without surface filling in. These are just the completed boundaries. And you might agree with me that it's very hard to make out who this is. And indeed, maybe even see that this is a person or a face. So we need both these processes, the boundary completion and the surface filling in. It's not just humans that have that. So there are very interesting experiments where you try to find out, is this something that might be inert, something that is born, something part of our genetic makeup, that we have these rules. And you can find out by taking chicks. So you wait until they hatch from an egg, and then you train them that if they're in a shoebox and they walk toward a triangle rather than a square, you give them something to eat. And once they do this reliably and they always walk towards a triangle rather than a square, now you show them the illusion. And it turns out that indeed they will walk towards what we see a triangle. These young chicks, they will seem also to fall for the illusion, see this triangle there. So again, that speaks for the idea that we had to do this, or lots of animals had to do this during the course of evolution to find predators that are trying to be camouflaged from us, that are trying to use the rules of our visual system as a weapon against us. Now, I'd just like to give you a very brief overview of an experiment that we did in my laboratory using these stimuli to find out a little bit more about what's going on. So I'd like to introduce you to Michelle Cox, shown here on the upper right side, is one of my graduate students. And she got interested in these stimuli in these two processes. There's one more process that I should introduce for that. So again, on the left-hand side, you can see these subjective shapes or illusory shapes where you see even three-dimensional shapes where indeed there is none. There's only, the only thing that's actually present are these black, what we call inducers. And maybe equally striking illusion in the middle is something that we call neon color spreading. So there is actual color on the display, but it's limited to the black parts of the display. But you might see a slight hue, a little bit almost like a haze or fog in between these colored parts. Does that work? So this hazy color perception is what we call neon color spreading, so that the color spreads between these colored parts. And if you combine these two so that you have an illusory contour and you add this color spreading to it, you get an even stronger effect of the illusion. And that was what we were after, to get a very strong illusion. And so what my laboratory does is we're trying to find out what the single neurons do in the brain for these illusions, because ultimately that's the level of computation that the brain works and that we have to understand these processes at. Now, it's very hard to record the activity of single neurons in humans because these are invasive experiments. They come with a high risk. And so they're limited to patients right now that really need that. So there are patients at Vanderbilt who have Parkinson's syndrome or severe depression or severe cases of epilepsy. And in these cases, it's ethically cleared to open their brains and insert microelectrodes. But in most of these cases, because of the nature of these diseases, we're limited to certain parts of the brain, and we can't explore the entire brain. So as long as we're living with that limitation, what Maier and other laboratories are doing, we're using animal models instead. And in particular, we're using non-human primates. So my laboratory, as well as other laboratories in the psychology department, we're using macaque monkeys. And the reason for that is that macaque monkeys are old world monkeys, such as we are. So their visual system is very similar. And indeed, if you test the vision of monkeys, of macaque monkeys in particular, it's very close to ours. They work in a very similar world. The other reason that we're using macaque monkeys is that they're very smart. And we can train them to do tasks so that they can work with us in these experiments. This is very elaborate work. So Michelle Cox has been working for her monkey for years. Every day she gets the monkey out of the cage, and then for 4 hours or so, she spends time with the animal trying to teach the animal a task. The only way she can communicate with the animal is with apple juice. Apple juice is something that macaques really appreciate. So every time the monkey does something right, the monkey gets a little bit of apple juice. And so slowly, step by step, the monkey learns what we would like to work with them. Once this is done, we do a surgery in a surgery suite that's very much as you can see them on television, with anesthesiologists, veterinarians there. The monkey gets deeply anesthetized, and we can open the skull of the animal and insert microelectrodes. And then we close everything up so it's painless to the animal. But after the surgery, we have what you can see here, this little chip implanted in the brain of the monkey, and that allows us to record the activity of single neurons while the monkeys are doing this task. And in this case, the task of the monkey was to look at a computer screen, and we would show the monkey these illusions that I just showed you. And you can see 2 of the stimuli right here to the left-hand side. You might see that there's a square. Again, we're combining here neon color spreading with these subjective contours. And to the right-hand side, it's almost the same stimulus, but you probably don't see a square because we rotate these Pac-Man, and that just destroys the illusion. And then we can record all these neurons at the same time from these microelectrodes, hundreds at the same time. And we can see what they get activated to. And there's something that's handy about the visual system, which is that things that are next to each other in the real world are also next to each other on the surface of the brain. So if we look at the activity of all these neurons that we record, and you can see that here from black to white, that they get more and more active, all of these neurons combined, they seem to react to this part of the visual space. 0, 0 is the fixation of the monkey. That's right where the monkey is looking at the computer screen. And you can see to the right lower corner of that, that is the activation of these neurons, and that's exactly where we showed these stimuli. And then what we do is we show these stimuli over and over and over again while the monkey keeps looking at the screen. Every time the monkey does that for a couple of 100 milliseconds, the monkey gets some apple juice. And on in the red and blue panels right here, what you can see, each dot is an action potential. So we isolate the discharge, the action potentials of these neurons, and each line is one of these trials. In red, you see the responses to the illusion, and in blue, you see the responses to the stimulus where the illusion doesn't work. You can see that for this particular neuron that we isolated, that neuron is way more active when the illusion is working for us than when the Pac-Man stimuli are rotated and the illusion doesn't work. Not only that, you can also see that it starts oscillating. So it has this swingy pattern to it where the spikes seem to happen in a certain rhythm. But just that neuron looking at that is something that, again, is for vision scientists like us extremely fascinating, because that illusion itself is something that really just happens in your head, right? So there's no actual square here. All I'm showing you is a few Pac-Man, and they're rotated towards each other, away from each other. But that neuron seems to represent that state of mind. That neuron fires only for the illusion, for something that's completely subjective, something that's only in your perception. It's almost as if we, as experimenters, can do mind reading, because we can see by listening to that neuron and the activity of the neuron, we can see whether the monkey sees the illusion or doesn't. a single brain cell. We went on, and the question was, well, since we have many neurons and they respond to different parts of that stimulus, would they respond differently with regard where they are placed? So what I'm going to show you here is an average of many neurons. And you can see here on the abscissa, from left to right, time in milliseconds. And on the ordinate, on the y-axis, you can see the firing rate of these neurons in impulses per second, or action potentials per second. And in red, I'm going to show you the response to the illusion. And in blue, the response to the stimulus where it doesn't have an illusion. And these error bars are the standard error of measure. You can see that if we look across all these neurons, and there were 71 in this case, so we isolated from the brain. If we look at the combined activity of these neurons, all of them fire more for the illusion, and they fire less for the control where there's not actually an illusory stimulus. Importantly, though, all of these neurons were placed right in the middle of that display where there isn't any stimulus. There is really just the background. It's a white background, or a black background in our experiment. So even though there's nothing physically present, these neurons became active because perceptually, subjectively, there is something. There's the surface that we see. So what about other neurons? So we also, this is what I just showed you. We looked at the neurons that responded right to the center of the display. But then we also looked at neurons, and this is shown here in the diagram on the upper row, that only responded, we've shifted the illusion, and now they only responded to a part of the illusion, such as the Pac-Man. And that is an interesting control, because the Pac-Man is the only part that actually physically changes. If you remember, we rotate them 180 degrees to induce the illusion or not. However, if we look at the activity of these neurons, they made no difference. So they did not respond to whether the illusion is active or not. These neurons didn't care about the actual change. And something that was very interesting when we looked across these populations of cells is when we looked at the onset of these responses, we saw that there were drastic differences. And by drastic, I mean that you can just see that these lines are not right on top of each other. We can compute that with a little bit more elaborate statistics. Excuse me. And what we find is that the neurons shown here in purple that respond to the surface of the illusion, they respond a little bit earlier than the neurons that responded to the contours, just the edges of the illusion, or the actual physical inducers, the Pac-Man themselves. And that is interesting for us because I told you that the idea was the visual system first extracts the edges and then fills in the contours, such as a painter might do. You first draft something out, and then you take your color and you fill in all these surfaces. These data suggest that that's wrong. It seems that the visual system first spreads out the color and then draws the edges around it. So to summarize that, this is the current model as it is commonly proposed in the literature of what is happening in the visual system with these illusions. The first stage is the retina, the back of your eye. And we know that neurons, they are not very smart. It's shown right here in the middle, labeled as on or off. These neurons, they have mostly, they only respond to literally little spots of light. And either spots of darkness or spot of light, that's why we call them on or off. So if we show them a visual stimulus such as this, the output of the eye is like a mosaic. Some of these neurons that just happen to have a dark stimulus there, they will respond, and the other neurons won't. If we take a step further into the actual brain now, and this is shown here as V1, the visual cortex, we know that these neurons, they get a little bit more complex. They get dissociated in what we call simple neurons, and then complex and hypercomplex neurons. And what these neurons do is they respond to lines. There was a Nobel Prize in the 1980s that was granted to two Harvard scientists for that discovery. So looking at these stimuli, that would mean that these neurons would respond to the lines of the actual Pac-Man. Importantly, they only respond to the physical lines. So they would parse out the mosaic from the retina and make out these discontinuous lines. And then the standard model went on to say that other areas of the brain outside the primary visual cortex, and I just labeled them here as extrastriate areas, they have much more complex responses, these neurons. So maybe these first complete these lines to completed boundaries or contours, and then we fill them in to surfaces. So that, again, here on the right would be a magnified version of that existing model as you'd find it in textbooks, that first you draw out the boundaries and then you fill in the surface. Our data suggests it's more likely something like that, that either you first fill in the surface or as a nod to the existing model, maybe these two processes happen in parallel. And as you fill in the surface, you also fill in the boundaries. Okay, so any questions about that? Yes.
Does it matter in color, and especially the fact that you're using an animal, when you use a human person, he recognizes color. But the animal that you already trained, would it matter if there was color or a different size of the object, whether you showed him a small card or a large card?
Excellent question, and the answer is yes, all of that matters. So I glossed over a lot of controls that we do to make sure that it's none of these things that would contaminate our results. So yes, it matters, but so we just show different colors, different size objects, and we make sure that it always holds. But yes, the visual, yeah.
What are the benefits of knowing this information?
Excellent question. Let me get right to that. So when I started my talk, I said that ultimately we're trying to build computers, machines that can do these kinds of tasks. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a car that we can just sit in and it can drive us home while we're reading the newspaper? But for that to be happening, the car would have to have that ability that we have, to see the world as we do and to respond to the world as we do. And what I showed you in the beginning is things still could look kind of bleak. So we are not even capable of recognizing individuals, let alone these bizarre, deformed individuals as I showed them to you. So the goal here is that we find out how the brain does it. How does the brain solve these complex things so quickly? And then we can implement them in a computer and thereby improve these computer programs and maybe one day get to these cars that drive us home. Does this make sense? If you have a little bit more time, then I could expand on that a little bit. Yes?
Just a basic question. I think all of us have had those menus where it says say or punch or say to. So are computers better at audio duplication than visual duplication? I just wondered because the Siri and all that seems like they've got some of the audio down.
Excellent question. So Professor Wallace, who was in here just recently, is going to talk next week, and he's an expert on that. So I'm going to defer the question to him. But I can tell you that, so you might have heard, because I just talked about these cars that might drive us around, you might have heard that California is allowing some of these cars already. So Google has built cars that can drive around, and they worked out the legalese. Who's going to be responsible if there's a traffic accident? The programmer, the person in the car, or Google itself. So they allow them to drive around. And so I have friends working on that project. And as a vision scientist, I went to them and I said, well, it seems like you solved all these vision problems. Now you can do that. They said, we abandoned it a long time ago. These cars, they work with radar. All that they do is they send out active radar and they get radar images because vision is so hard we're not even trying. So I don't know what tricks they use in the auditory domain, but I agree with you. These automatic replies, if you call CVS and so on, are quite impressive. Even with my German accent, they understand me. So. Yep.
What happens with a blind person? Shut down in the brain also?
Yeah, so that's another great question. So it depends on what kind of blindness. So there are, you can be blind because your eye doesn't work. And a lot of this work that we're doing right here is also in the hope that we can help these patients. Because if we understand how these processes work, maybe we can, instead of reading out with these electrodes, feeding in information. And we can have them wear goggles with cameras, process that data the way the brain likes it to have, and then feed it back into their brains, and they should be able to see. So just like there are cochlear implants for people that have hearing loss, you might have retina implants for people to see again. Now that obviously requires that you still have a functional brain that can process that information. And indeed, you can also have loss of function by having lesions to the brain itself, to the visual cortex, and that would make it much more hard. And even in that case, if we can find out what the visual cortex is doing, which I'm showing here right in the middle, maybe we can take a step further and then implant these electrodes in other parts of the brain, mimic the output of the primary visual cortex, and bypass all of that apparatus that doesn't work anymore. So ultimately, that's another goal, that we can help people to see again.
Would this also be used for facial recognition?
Yes. So obviously there's a huge interest in facial recognition ultimately, since that is one of the most important tasks for us. There's so many people that we rely on recognizing very quickly, and it would be an important task for law enforcement and other applications as well. So all of this kind of knowledge goes into the work that is done by programmers to find out how we can improve facial recognition. The problems that they work with is that if I shave tomorrow, I look very different. So how could their computer program recognize me still as the same person? If I step over here, the light on my face is changing. If I rotate my head, you see it from different angles, but it's still the same person, you know that, but how does the computer do it? And these are the very first step leading up to that.
On the other side of it, it's another form of loss of privacy.
Yes. Yes, that's. I agree with that. So that's why I showed the hairstyle that you can put on maybe to escape that. There are, I think, as with everything, if you come up with a new tool, there's good and bad uses for it, right? And so the tool itself is neither good nor bad, and it's what you do with it. So that's a separate societal discussion, whether we agree and approve with the fact that it might be possible one day that no matter where you walk, all these cameras that are in here are recognizing your face and linking that up with other data that is known about you. So yes, that's another thing to think about. Yes.
My mother had macular degeneration, and so she could not see the features in my face, but she had the peripheral vision. So how is that working? Is the boundary system is making the connection, telling her that it is me approaching her?
That's a very interesting case. So indeed, our peripheral vision is very different than our point of view vision. And that's why we like to move our eyes around a lot. Now, it's very interesting. I never thought about it. I'm not sure other people have, that it's possible that these processes are limited to our center of view. And that if you have macular degeneration, for example, you might lose them, and you have to cope with different strategies. So I don't know the answer to that, but that's a very interesting point. There was another question back there.
Last week, I think Dr. Blake said something about a disease where people don't see faces or can't recognize.
Yeah.
Is that part of this?
Yeah, so that disease is called prosopagnosia, and it's as you can imagine, it's a devastating disease. It's a disorder rather. It happens after stroke very frequently, but people can cope. Often, if they're married, for example, their spouse can help them out at a cocktail party and whisper in their ear who's approaching. But all faces look the same to them. They indeed have problems even recognizing their spouse, or indeed themselves in a mirror. They often they tell that if they walk into a bathroom, they back out because they think there's somebody in there when they see their own reflection. Now, these processes, they happen a little bit further down the line. So everything I'm showing you is leading up to that. So the brain areas that get lesioned or destroyed if you have prosopagnosia, they receive the output of these areas. So these are they do the grunt work or the dirty work that ultimately then in these higher brain areas get interpreted as faces. This is really just the first steps of taking a two-dimensional image and trying to extract what kind of shapes and three-dimensional objects are in there. Other questions? Yeah.
What happens with face recognition as you age?
Yeah.
If you're a child and they take your face, then how do they know it's you when you're 60?
That's another excellent question that I'm afraid I have to defer. I don't know that much about that. So I know that vision develops surprisingly late. So if you have newborn babies, they don't see very well, if at all. And so that has been studied a lot in terms of when do you start to see and when do you start to see first faces, and does that coincide with the time when they start smiling, when you smile at them and so on. But I don't know that much, unfortunately, about how that might change later in life. So,
I'm not sure I said
okay,
it correctly, or I didn't understand.
sure.
I'm 12 years old.
Yeah.
In my place. I'm 60 years old. How do you still going to know it's
Okay, got it. Well, again, so that is something that for a vision scientist just seems miraculous. So how we can do that? No idea is the short answer. Yeah. To repeat the question, how is it possible that you might see someone while they're 12 years old, and then you meet them again decades later, and you can recognize that person even though their face has changed dramatically?
with the facial recognition?
With that software?
They're going with the software.
Yeah.
If I'm 12 years old and you do it, and then I'm a terrorist and I'm 60 years
Right.
old, how are you going to know that that's
Yeah, I don't think that's exactly the problem. So I don't think that they're capable of doing that right now. And how we do it, again, is if anyone has an idea, I'd be happy to share the Nobel Prize. All right. If you have no more questions, thank you very much.